They say that out here in Arizona, land is the only thing worth dying for. I used to think that was just old cowboy talk from the movies, but that was before I met my neighbor, Gary. My name is Jack. I live in the foothills outside of Prescott, Arizona. It's beautiful out here. Red rocks, stunted pines, and enough space between neighbors that you shouldn't have to worry about whose dog is peeing on whose cactus. I own 5 acres of rugged, beautiful desert. My house sits on a ridge, and my property line runs down a slope into a dry wash. It's quiet. Or it was until Gary decided he wanted to expand his empire by exactly 9 inches. It started on a Saturday morning. I was sitting on my porch, drinking a coffee and watching the hawks circle, when I saw Gary. Gary is a retiree with too much time on his hands and a serious king of the mountain complex. He was out near the edge of our shared boundary with a roll of string and a bundle of wooden stakes. Now, in Arizona, property lines in the mountains can be tricky. The ground is rocky, and the original surveys from the 60s and 70s were sometimes, let's say, approximate. But I knew where my line was. My father had bought this land in 1982, and the iron pins were as solid as the mountains themselves. I watched Gary hammer a stake into the dirt. Then he moved 9 inches toward my side and hammered another one. He was literally leapfrogging his way down the line, carving out a tiny 9-inch strip of my property. I didn't get angry at first. I just thought he was confused. I walked down the slope, boots crunching on the dry needles. "Morning, Gary," I said, keeping it neighborly. "Doing some landscaping?" Gary didn't look up. He was squinting at his string line like he was measuring the perimeter of the Pentagon. "Jack, just fixing what's mine. I had a buddy look at the old plat maps. Seems your fence line has been encroaching on my northern edge for years. I'm just reclaiming the dirt." I looked at the 9 inches. It was a joke. It was a tiny strip of dust and rocks. "Gary, that string is nearly a foot onto my lot. The iron pin is right over there by the juniper bush." Gary finally looked at me. His face was leathered by the sun and set in a permanent scowl. That pin? That pin was moved in the 90s, Jack. I know the law. Adverse possession starts with a claim. I'm claiming it." He turned back to his work and hammered the next stake. That was the moment. The quiet neighbor Jack died, and the don't tread on me Jack was born. To understand Gary, you have to understand the type of guy who moves to the Arizona mountains to get away from it all, but then spends every waking hour trying to control everything in sight. He had a house that looked like a fortress, all stucco and clay tile, and he treated his yard like a military base. He had a wife, Susan, who was the unofficial enforcement officer of the neighborhood. She didn't use a clipboard, she used her phone camera. If your guest parked an inch too close to their driveway, Susan was there taking photos and threatening to call the sheriff. For the last year, Gary had been building. He built a massive detached garage for his RV. He built a stone retaining wall. He built a shed that looked big enough to house a small family. And every time he built something, it got a little closer to my line. But this 9-inch string line was different. It wasn't about the land. It was about the insult. He was testing me. He figured I was a younger guy, busy with work, and wouldn't want the hassle of a legal fight over a few inches of desert. The next day, Gary didn't just have string. He had a post hole digger. He started installing a permanent chain link fence along his new line. I walked over again. "Gary, I'm telling you one last time, stop digging. If you put that fence there, you're making a very expensive mistake." Susan came out onto their back patio holding a glass of iced tea like it was a scepter. "Jack, don't be a bully. Gary is just protecting our equity. You should be happy we're improving the area." "Improving it by stealing my dirt?" I asked.
"It's not stealing if it's ours," Gary shouted over the sound of the metal digger hitting a rock. "Get a lawyer or get lost, Jack." I didn't get a lawyer, at least not yet. I did something much more dangerous in a property dispute. I called the most expensive, most meticulous land surveyor in the state of Arizona. His name was Miller. He was a lanky guy in his 50s who looked like he had spent his entire life looking through a telescope. He arrived on Wednesday in a white truck loaded with GPS equipment that cost more than Gary's RV. "I hear you've got a boundary issue," Miller said, looking at the bright orange string Gary had stretched across the dirt. "My neighbor thinks he owns 9 inches of my yard," I explained. "He's already started pouring concrete for the fence posts." Miller looked at Gary's fence posts, then he looked at the horizon. He didn't say anything. He just started unloading his gear. For the next 6 hours, I watched a master at work. Miller didn't just look for pins. He went back to the original 1912 land grants. He used a satellite-linked GPS that narrowed his position down to the millimeter. He spent 2 hours just clearing brush near the dry wash, looking for a monument mentioned in a deed from 1954. Gary came out around noon. He stood on his porch, arms crossed, smirking. "Wasting your money, Jack. My buddy already told me where the line is. That guy is just charging you by the hour to tell you I'm right." Miller didn't even acknowledge Gary existed. He just kept working. Around 4 p.m., Miller called me over. He was standing near Gary's massive new detached RV garage, the one Gary had finished 6 months ago. "Jack," Miller said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "I have some news, and I think you're going to want to sit down for this." "He's right about the 9 inches?" I asked, my heart sinking. Miller started to laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had just found a winning lottery ticket in the trash. "Jack, your neighbor isn't right about the 9 inches, but he's right that the line is in the wrong place." Miller walked 20 feet into Gary's yard. He stood right next to the corner of Gary's brand new $50,000 RV garage. "The line is here," Miller said, slamming an orange-topped stake into the ground. I stared at him. "You're saying Gary's garage is on my land?" "Not just the garage, Jack," Miller said, grinning. "His stone retaining wall, half of his driveway, and about 30% of his master bedroom addition. He didn't just encroach by 9 inches, Jack. Gary has been living on 20 feet of your land for years. He's the one who's been trespassing." I felt a surge of adrenaline that was better than any cup of coffee. Gary had tried to bully me for 9 inches, and in his arrogance, he had exposed the fact that his entire empire was built on my dirt. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Well," Miller said, "I'm going to file this certified survey with the county recorder tomorrow morning. Once it's recorded, it's legal fact. Then you call a lawyer, because Gary doesn't just have a fence problem. Gary has a 'your house is illegal' problem." But I didn't call the lawyer immediately. I wanted to see if Gary would finish that fence. The next morning, Gary was out there early, pouring wet concrete into the holes along the 9-inch line. He was whistling. He looked so happy. He thought he had won. "Looking good, Gary," I shouted from my porch. "That concrete looks nice and permanent." "Told you, Jack," Gary yelled, triumphant. "Possession is 9/10 of the law. Once this concrete sets, this land is Gary land." "I'm sure it is, Gary," I said, smiling. I waited until the concrete was bone dry. I waited until Gary had finished the chain-link fence and even added a little gate. He spent the whole weekend admiring it. He even invited some people over for a barbecue to celebrate his victory. I could hear them laughing over the fence about the kid next door who didn't know his own property. On Monday morning at exactly 9 a.m., I drove to the county recorder's office. I watched them stamp the new survey. It was official. The map of the world had changed. Then I went to a law firm in downtown Prescott. I handed the lawyer, a sharp woman named Elena, the new survey and photos of Gary's new fence, his garage, and his master bedroom. Elena looked at the papers. She looked at the photos. She slowly leaned back in her chair and let out a long, low whistle. "Oh, Mr. Thompson," she said, "this isn't just a boundary dispute. This is a total loss for your neighbor. He built permanent structures over a recorded property line without an easement. In Arizona, that's a mandatory removal order if the owner, that's you, demands it." "I don't just want it moved," I said. "I want my 20 feet back. All of it." "Then let's send Gary a little welcome to the neighborhood letter," Elena said, reaching for her pen. The thing about living in a small town like Prescott is that news travels faster than a brush fire in a drought. But legal news, that travels by certified mail. After my meeting with Elena, I spent the rest of the week doing exactly nothing. I watched Gary out of my kitchen window. He was out there every evening with a garden hose, watering the patch of dirt along his new 9-inch fence line, probably envisioning the expensive desert shrubs he was going to plant. He looked smug. He looked like a man who had won a war I hadn't even started fighting yet. On Thursday afternoon, the mail truck pulled up. I saw the carrier walk to Gary's fortress-like front door. Gary happened to be out front checking his oversized mailbox. He signed for the letter with a flourish, probably thinking it was a fancy invitation or a new deed. I sat on my porch, cracked open a cold soda, and waited. About 3 minutes later, the silence of the Arizona foothills was shattered. It wasn't a hawk or a coyote. It was Gary. He didn't just scream, he roared. The sound of a 65-year-old man having a complete ego collapse is something you don't forget. He came charging down the slope toward my house, waving Elena's letter in the air like a white flag that had caught fire. Susan was right behind him, her phone already recording the assault she was sure I was about to commit. "Jack, you coward! What is this?" Gary screamed, stopping at the orange string line. I didn't stand up. I just leaned back in my chair. "Morning, Gary. Looks like you got the mail." "This letter says my garage is on your land. It says I have to tear down my stone wall. It says I'm encroaching by 22 feet. He was shaking so hard the paper was rattling. "I've lived here 5 years. This is my land." "Actually, Gary," I pointed to the manila folder on my lap, "according to the warranty deed recorded in volume 442, page 19 of the Yavapai County records, and the certified survey Miller filed yesterday morning, you've been living on my land for 5 years. I've been paying the property taxes under the dirt of your garage. Think of me as your very quiet, very generous landlord." But the lease just expired. Susan stepped forward, her voice shrill enough to peel paint. "We'll sue you for harassment. This is emotional distress. We have adverse possession rights." I finally stood up. I'm a head taller than Gary, and I made sure he felt it. "Susan, you might want to Google Arizona Revised Statute Section 12-526. To claim adverse possession in this state, Gary would have had to have open, notorious, and hostile use of that land for 10 consecutive years while paying the property taxes on it. You've been here for 5, and I'm the one who's been paying the taxes. Elena, my lawyer, calls that a slam dunk. Miller, my surveyor, calls it the biggest screw-up he's seen in a decade." Gary looked at the letter again. He looked at the orange stakes Miller had hammered deep into the rocky ground, stakes that were sitting 20 feet behind Gary's victory fence. 20 feet? Gary whispered, the rage finally giving way to pure, cold terror. That's half my backyard. My RV garage cost me $52,000 to build. The retaining wall was another 12. I know, and it's all sitting on my lot, which means if you don't move it, I technically own a very expensive garage I never asked for. But I don't want your garage. I want my view back.
In the modern American suburb, the courtroom isn't the only place you fight. You fight on the Nextdoor app and the Prescott Foothills Community Facebook group. By 6 p.m. that night, Susan had posted a 500-word manifesto. Warning to neighbors, Jack T is trying to steal our home. He hired a corrupt surveyor to fake property lines and is threatening to bulldoze our garage. We are retirees being bullied by a young man with a grudge. Please stand with us. Within an hour, there were 40 comments. Half the neighbors were horrified. People I'd known for years were liking Susan's post. One guy, 3 streets over, called me a land-grabbing vulture. This is the social pressure phase. They wanted to shame me into a settlement. They wanted me to be the bad guy so I'd feel guilty and just give them the land. I didn't argue. I didn't get into a comment war. I simply uploaded 3 things to the group: a PDF of the county plat map from 1982, a high-resolution photo of the iron pin Miller found 2 feet underground, the invoice from my $1,800 survey and $2,400 legal retainer. I added a simple caption. Gary tried to take 9 inches of my yard last week with a string line and a post hole digger. I hired a professional to find the real line. Turns out, Gary's garage, driveway, and bedroom are 22 feet over the line. I'm not stealing his home. I'm reclaiming the land I've been paying taxes on for 11 years. Check your deeds, folks. The dirt doesn't lie. The tone of the group shifted in an instant. The vulture comments were deleted. The neighbors who had been watching Gary's construction projects for years started realizing why their own drainage was messed up. Gary wasn't the victim. He was the guy who hadn't done his homework and tried to bully the wrong neighbor.
Gary didn't give up easy. He hired his own lawyer, a guy who charged him a $3,000 retainer just to look at the paperwork. He even hired his own surveyor to re-verify Miller's work. I saw the second surveyor out there on Tuesday. He spent 3 hours. I saw him stand near Gary's garage, look at Miller's stakes, look at his own equipment, and just shake his head. He didn't even finish the day. He packed up his tripod and left. He knew. That evening, Gary walked over. He didn't have Susan with him. He didn't have a phone. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a week. "Jack," he said, standing at the 9-inch fence, "my lawyer says, he says you have the right to a judicial lien if this goes to court. He says the city will never approve a retroactive easement because the garage is too close to the wash. It's a setback violation, too." "I know," I said. "Miller checked the municipal zoning. You're within the 30-foot riparian buffer of the dry wash. That garage should have never been built there, even if it was on your land." "If I tear it down," Gary said, his voice cracking, "I lose everything. The demolition alone is going to cost me 15 grand because of the concrete slab and the electrical rerouting, plus the cost of a new garage on the other side of my house. I'm looking at an $80,000 mistake." I looked at Gary. For a second, I felt a flicker of sympathy. But then I looked at the 9-inch fence, the one Gary had hammered into my yard while laughing at me. I thought about the 11 years I'd spent maintaining this lot. "Gary," I said, "you didn't make an $80,000 mistake. You made a 9-inch mistake. If you had just stayed on your side of the line, we'd be having a beer right now. But you wanted to be the king of the mountain. You wanted my 9 inches. Well, now,
you're going to give me my 22 feet. In Arizona, we have monsoon season. Huge, violent thunderstorms that dump 2 inches of rain in 20 minutes. Because Gary had built his stone retaining wall and garage 22 feet onto my land, he had redirected the natural flow of the dry wash. A week after our talk, a massive storm rolled in. The sky turned purple and the rain came down in sheets. I watched from my porch as the water backed up against Gary's illegal wall. Because it wasn't engineered for that location, the water started undermining the foundation of my house. That was the end of the negotiations. Elena filed for an emergency injunction. We didn't just ask for the land, we sued for slander of title and environmental damage. We requested a pre-judgment writ of attachment, basically a legal lock on Gary's house so he couldn't sell it and run away before fixing the mess. The court order came down on a Friday. Gary had 60 days to remove all encroachments and restore the land to its original grade. If he didn't, the city would do it for him and send him the bill as a tax assessment lien. The following Monday, the demolition crew arrived. It wasn't the hustle crew Gary had used to build the garage. It was a professional environmental restoration team. The sound of the jackhammers hitting that $52,000 garage was the most satisfying noise I've ever heard. Thump, 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 thump. The stucco crumbled. The steel beams were twisted out like old wire. The stone wall, the one Susan was so proud of, was reduced to a pile of rubble in 4 hours. Gary and Susan stayed inside. Their curtains were drawn tight. The whole neighborhood drove by, slowing down to see the great reclaiming. When the garage was gone, the crew brought in 3 dump trucks of clean fill dirt. They regraded the slope to Miller's exact specifications. They removed every inch of that 9-inch chain link fence. Total cost to Gary? Demolition, $14,500. Surveyors and legal fees, $9,200. Land restoration, $6,000. Lost property value, estimated, $70,000. Today, my backyard is open again. The dry wash flows exactly where it's supposed to. The hawks still circle. Gary and Susan still live next door, but they don't come outside much. They finally put up a fence, a small, modest wood fence that sits exactly 6 inches on their side of the line. They didn't use string this time. They used Miller's survey maps. I still mow my lawn. Every time I reach that 22-foot mark, the place where Gary's garage used to stand, I stop for a second. I look at the dirt. It's just dirt and rocks, but it's my dirt and my rocks. Some people in the Prescott Facebook group still think I was too hard on them. They say I could have just signed an easement and let him keep the garage. But here's the reality of land in America. If you don't defend your line, you don't have a home. You have a suggestion. So I'm asking you, if your neighbor tried to steal a few inches of your life, would you have checked the map? Or would you have let them build their empire on your foundation? Because out here in Arizona, we have a saying, good fences make good neighbors, but a good survey makes a fool out of a bully. Drop a comment below. I read every one of them. And before you buy that post hole digger, make sure you know where the iron pins are buried.